was an artist. This guy asked me to do some drawings for his TTRPG. Hey gamers, Noelle here, your favorite illustrator / MCR fan, and today I'm going to demonstrate some concept art tips and tricks using some real examples from client work. This rad group here is doing a Kickstarter to release a D&D module known as Reign of the Sundered Idol. So it's a little supplement. You can use it for 5th edition or other tabletop RPGs to add a little bit of depth and fun to your world. And I was hired to do some of the illustrations for them. Illustrations I will now be showing you. This batch is all creatures, so some of the advice will be specific to that. But don't worry, there's plenty of general concept tips in there as well. First up are star jellies. They are pretty heavily inspired by moon jellies, as you can probably tell. What with the glowing and the being jellyfish part, but that's just a coincidence. One element that I think shines really good here is the use of big, medium, and small elements. There is one large element that takes up the majority of the composition, one medium-sized element off in the lower right corner, and then a couple of tiny little tertiary elements. This one's a pretty fast speed paint, so as you can see, we're basically already done. And those are the moon jellies. Pretty simple color palette as well. Chugging right on along to the cactus pup. Another small creature, another one that's relatively friendly to humans. This little guy is friendly and very, very sweet. A lovely companion. So I tried to really emphasize that in the design. I'm making him as round as possible. This guy is almost all circles, which creates the result of making him look like the softest, bestest boy. Of course, this is all an illusion as he is covered in extremely sharp spikes. So be careful. Think before you pet. Another thing I'd like to point out here, the use of big, medium, and small elements. We've got the big shape, which is the body, the medium shapes, which are the head and tail, and then the smaller shapes, which are the legs, the tiny little prickly pear bits on his tail, and more or less the flowers. If I had planned ahead, I probably would have set some of these elements to be a slightly different size. I'm a little bit worried that it's a little bit too samey as is. That being said, I do think he's very cute. To finish it off, I popped in a quick background and added a few cacti, blurred the one in the foreground, and we're done. Alright, moving on to my favorite of the bunch, probably. We have the Oasis turtle. You can see me thumbnailing this out here, trying to figure out values. And then I just figured, why not? And I charged right into it, doing line work over the shapes to try and retain my original thing, because I really liked how he looked. He was very sturdy, but also very delightful looking. I don't know why I decided to set this at a low camera angle. I think I just really liked the drama of it all. The result is that he looks quite a bit bigger than he would normally. This guy actually took the longest, I believe, out of all of these drawings. And that is because, for some reason, I decided to really go ham on the shell and like the textures and all of that. Like with most of these guys, it was basically I'd lay down a basic texture and then I'd just add shading on top of it. But for some reason, something about this guy, I wanted to go the distance with him painting. So the result is that he's maybe a bit more detailed than he needs to be. That being said, I was trying out some things, I figured out some things, so I can't feel bad about it. Also, look at him. Isn't he cute? Isn't he delightful? Aren't you delighted? I'm adding in the plants now. You can see that wow, that looks wild sped up. My crazy, trying out different brushes. Yeah, I tried out a bunch of different brushes to see if any had a sort of similar texture to what I was looking for, and none of them did. So instead, I just hand drew the prairie grass. Like a maniac. Something in my brain unlocked, and I was like, this is the best use of my time. And you know what? It looks great, so maybe that was the best use of my time. Since the prairie grass itself was a little bit boring, I added, oh, there's a type of prairie flower. Prairie clover! Yes, so I popped some prairie clovers on his back, or at least flowers that kind of look like prairie clovers. I will admit that I wasn't exactly going for accuracy here, given this is a fantasy creature. My goal with these drawings is to draw, pun intended, enough inspiration from real life that the creature seems more or less based in reality, while still kind of leaning into those fantastical elements that make the creature look fun, like exaggerated shapes and bright colors. This turtle is also a great example of using sparing amounts of a complementary color to really just pop your design. Whenever I look into those eyes, I find myself very taken with him. I've got nothing to be sad about. Up next, the Mirage Manta. I enjoyed working on this one quite a bit, though you can see I struggled. I wound up using a perspective grid in order to figure out how the things like the wings and the antenna would line up. Though perspective grids don't tend to work well for organic shapes, you can definitely use them so that you can figure out at what point something should start and end. They can also be really careful if you draw an organic shape straight on, you can then warp it to fit your perspective grid and have more or less a fantastic facsimile of what it's going to look like that you can use as a guide later on to make your line work look freaking impeccable. I mean, like, look at this wing. Doesn't it look like I know what I'm doing? That's the secret, Cap. Perspective grids. Something that I rather enjoyed about this guy's character design is that he is both very round and very spiky, a big combination of both circular and triangular shapes. I wanted to kind of give the impression that this guy's generally harmless, but could be rather harmful. So a solid blend of sharp and round there. This was one of the earlier pieces that I did. I believe it was actually the second one that I worked on. So you can see that I'm still kind of figuring out some of the shading methods and coloring methods that I'm going to use for the rest of the monsters. So this was sort of my flagship drawing, if you will. And ooh, look, there I go in with that complementary color palette again. This guy's in the desert. I figured he would work well as an ambush predator, so I thought it would be really fun to have his back be covered in a sort of sandy color, while his stomach is a light, almost sky blue. Kind of in the same way that many fish have darker tops and lighter bottoms, so that other fish won't really see them coming because they'll blend in better with the environment. Penguins also have this. Since this whole thing's mirages as well, I thought it'd be fun to give him kind of a pattern that sort of harkens back to eyes and things regarding like vision, so sort of spots, iris-y. I spent a lot longer fiddling with the shading on this guy than I remember. Alright, finally, I suppose I'm happy with him now. So here I go, and I'm adding a background. In this case, I think the background was essential because it makes it clear that this guy's actually like flying as opposed to just kind of sitting there rolling over, which was an image that I couldn't get out of my head prior. Of course, I spent forever fiddling with the shadow and messing with the sand, but I've got to say I'm very pleased with how it came out. Added some small speed lines using an oil brush, which, by the way, turns out that's a fantastic way to use those. It works really well. So here's the Mirage Manta. Delighted with how he came out. Up next, Storm Crow. Now this guy's a real dangerous little fella, real angry bird. So I was really focused on making him look pretty sharp as possible. ASAP, that's what that acronym stands for. So he does have some anatomy in common with corvids, most specifically the leg structure and how the wings attach to the body, but I made a lot of effort to have those elements be different as well. I don't want him to just look like a crow, I want him to look like some fantasy bird. So you'll see that I exaggerate the way that the wings attach to the body quite a bit. If this guy extends his wings, they would be very thin and sharp. You'll notice I'm using the word sharp a lot. Again, comes back to shape design. If you have something with a lot of pointy triangle shapes, your brain's like, ah, dangerous, sharp, do not touch. This guy's actually the opposite of the cactus pup now that I think about it. Dangerous shapes, but soft to the touch, while the cactus pup is gentle shapes, but very dangerous to the touch. Interesting. Interesting. I don't know if that says anything about anything. Anyway, I got tired, so I used a brush to add some birds. So those are other storm crows, I suppose. The light and shadows are pretty muted just because of all the particulate in the air. It's creating a color-based barrier, and that translates to things almost looking like they're underwater. Now on to our last piece. So this is a tree mimic, whereas most mimics disguise themselves as like natural human objects, this one's just disguising itself as a dead tree stump. I actually kind of like this guy. He's very cozy under there, and I think that's fun. I also thought it was clever to have the teeth come up underneath the eyes through the snow, almost like they're the tips of tree roots, but they're not. Surprise! It's actually a problem. I got to use a bit more of a complementary color palette on this one as well, using sort of a brownish muted tone for most of the elements of the tree mimic, and then getting to use sort of bright blue tones for the background, which I think works really well. It's like this little moment of warmth in an otherwise very cold scene. Also, I like how threatening he is. Just a little upsetting guy. Oh, there I go, adding some tree trunk texture and a little bit of snow. And with a little texture in the background, the tree mimic is also done. So there it is, my little process and thoughts behind 6 of the monsters that are featured in this upcoming booklet. Here's a quick wrap-up and a very quick review of some of the design principles that I used while creating these guys, that you too can apply to your work in order to make fun little things. 1. Shapes. Use rounder shapes to convey a feeling of softness, safety, or comfort. Use flat, angular, sort of rectangular shapes to provide a sense of stability and strength, and use triangular or sharp shapes in order to promote feelings of danger, instability, and yikes! You can use combinations of these shapes in order to make even more interesting things. Another thing I talked quite a bit about was shape hierarchy, big, medium, and small. You generally want to have one big shape, 1 or 2 secondary shapes, which are quite a bit smaller than the original shape, and then several tertiary shapes that are very small, little details that add visual interest, but don't necessarily carry the visual weight of the piece. Good example is this little turtle here. The primary shape is the round mass that comprises his body. The secondary shapes of his head and legs support the primary shape, and then the tertiary shapes of the grass and the prairie clover are just there for visual interest and flavor. An example of how that would look if the elements aren't actually attached would be the jellyfish. In this case, it's more of a compositional thing. There's a big blob in the composition, a medium blob in the composition, and then a couple small blobs, just, for visual flavor. The final element that I talk a bit about, that I think is very, very helpful when designing your creatures, is just a little bit of color design. Specifically, complementary color design. I'm not saying that you should take both ends of the color wheel and just kind of smash them together, because 90% of the time that looks terrible. Don't do that. Instead, take general color families, such as a series of muted greens, and then combine them with a little pop of a warmer color in order to, again, add a bit of visual punch. Humans love contrast. We love contrast in shapes. We love contrast in color. We love contrast in line and dark and light and all of this stuff. The more contrast you can include into your pieces, generally speaking, the more interesting a design you're going to end up with. Just for giggles, here's what it would look like if I redesigned my cactus pup taking none of these principles into consideration. So, all the elements of the cactus pup are one size. The colors are too bright and don't go very well with each other. And for no reason whatsoever, I made him a square, which doesn't really tell you a whole lot about what he's like. Which again, actually circles back. If you're going to make a design, Try to make it so that it visually ties back to what the thing actually is, or what it's doing, or what its actions are. Because it's fantastic if a design looks good, but if that design doesn't actually communicate what you want it to communicate to your audience, it's essentially useless. I hope this video was a little bit educational for you. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like my silly little drawings or my silly little attitude and want to hear/see more of me, please consider subscribing. I'm just a little channel, so again, any support you give is super appreciated. Have a good one, peace out, and make good art!